If people are struggling to hear or see or whatever, then just stop me and we'll figure it out. So hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. Hopefully I won't rattle on for too long, but I can see all the chat on the side here. So if anyone has questions or wants me to stop and talk about something else, then just send a message or whatever. I thought I would start by just a little bit on my background and the background of my role at the Star. So I'm from outside Guelph and did my undergrad at U of T in Peace and Conflict Studies. And oh, my screen is moving around a lot apparently, so I'm gonna put it on my coffee table, and hopefully that is better. So yeah, did my undergrad at U of T, and then got a scholarship to study in the UK and do my master's there in political science. So I don't actually have a formal journalism background or training, but I knew that I wanted to be a journalist. And after I finished my master's, I ended up getting an internship with a news channel in London and worked there for a few years. And then I went out to Kenya to work for a newspaper there through the Aga Khan Foundation of Canada, which sends 2 young journalists out there every year on a reporting fellowship. And while I was there, I was reporting for the newspaper, but also freelancing myself for other organizations. And then off the back of that, I started working for the BBC for their African current affairs programming. So I was based in London and traveling around to the continent. And I'd been there for about a year when the Star posted this job, the work and wealth reporter position. And I always knew that I wanted to come back home and work here as a journalist. And so it seemed like a great opportunity, but I had no experience whatsoever in labor reporting or labor issues in general. I had like an interest in social justice issues and human rights issues, but I didn't have really any foundation. So it was sort of kind of a leap of faith for the Star to take me on. But the background to this position is that, as some of you will know, the Star is sort of guided by the Atkinson Principles, which was sort of the vision of our founding publisher and what he hoped the newspaper would accomplish and would kind of stand for. And amongst those principles is the rights of working people. So it's sort of always been central to who we are as a newspaper, to report on and cover issues that affect ordinary working people. And so we'd always had a labor reporter, like most mainstream news organizations. That used to be kind of fundamental, a fundamental beat in the newsroom. But I think when I was hired, the position had been vacant for about 2 years. I think the last labor reporter had gone on to a role on the editorial board at the Star, and the position hadn't been filled. Resources were getting increasingly scarce because of the financial situation that so many newspapers have found themselves in. And so the Atkinson Foundation, which is the philanthropic body that's sort of affiliated or associated with the Toronto Star, stepped in to say that they would provide funding to the Toronto Star to fill the position. And it's a totally hands-off relationship, and the Star hired me and managed me and directs the beat and shapes the beat, but the funding comes from the Atkinson Foundation. So this is sort of a new model for us to hopefully try and make these types of social justice type beats sustainable in newsrooms. So that's a little bit of background as to how this came to be, and I thought I'd talk a little bit now about how I sort of built the beat, because there wasn't much of a template for me when I started. And I remember, I think my first or second week on the job, my editor at the time saying to me, like, what are you supposed to be doing here? Like, what are you actually reporting on? And I didn't really know. There was no kind of sense of where we wanted to take the beat as an organization. So I spent a lot of time sort of flailing and trying to figure out what direction I was going to take it in. And I think that actually that process was really useful and helpful as a journalist, because it really pushed me to just build kind of contacts from the ground up. And so I started meeting with a lot of grassroots organizers, workers' centers, legal clinics, who really had the best sense of what was happening on the ground to workers. And in the early days on the beat, I really kind of erred toward lots of smaller, sort of quicker hits. Not my most substantial work by any stretch, but it was kind of getting the beat out there and sort of getting my name out there. And from there, I started getting, tips coming in and getting a sense of what kind of stories readers reacted to and said, like, I'm struggling with the same thing. And from there, really starting to understand what the systemic problems on my beat were. And I think that allowed us to kind of shape the beat to be kind of, well, hopefully what could be considered as a modern labor beat, where, I'm not, as a reporter, super focused on union politics or collective bargaining and the kind of traditional labor subjects. Not that those things aren't important, but really what I was seeing was this huge and growing number of workers who didn't have the protection of a union and who didn't really have a platform to get their concerns heard. And so that is really what I decided to start focusing on. And the first big series that I did was on these loopholes in the Employment Standards Act and kind of looking at how vulnerable workers were falling through the cracks. And I think that was really what crystallized what the beat was supposed to be, or what the beat was really all about for me as a reporter, and helped kind of define what sort of stories I was going to pursue as time went on. The other kind of part of the beat that I started developing a little bit later was the coverage of the workers' compensation system. And that one was actually, various reporters in the newsroom had sort of tackled it on and off, but it was such a kind of overwhelming and daunting and complex subject, where a lot of the folks who were getting in touch were really kind of deep in crisis and really struggling with the bureaucracy of the compensation system. And I think for a lot of reporters who are under, time constraints, resource constraints, it's tough to take that kind of subject on, because it's a time suck. And I think that's really where being a beat reporter is useful and valuable to a newsroom, because you are given the time as a beat reporter to really familiarize yourself with kind of niche topics and learn enough about them to make them relatable to our readers. The first story I wrote about the compensation world, saying, like, I've been through the same thing as well. Some people are saying there's an issue with the feed. Is it okay? Okay. I'll just wait for a thing. All good. So inundated with responses on the workers' compensation system. And again, like, it's a story that isn't particularly sexy on the face of it, but once you kind of dig into it, you start to see how deeply it impacts, a segment of society who's sort of crying out for someone to voice those issues. And the challenge, I think, as a reporter is making those problems and those challenges relatable again to your readers and putting a human face on it. And I think that's where building those really good relationships with the worker centers and the legal clinics who start to trust you as a reporter and trust that you will treat people's stories and treat people who often are in a point of crisis in their life with the appropriate amount of sensitivity. So those relationships are really important, I think, to establish early on as a beat reporter, and particularly a beat reporter on workplace issues where it is a very sensitive topic. And I remember one of my editors saying to me, like, very early on, that he really, he didn't know how things were going to go for me, because in his experience, it's so hard to get workers to speak about their job. So that, and that it makes total sense, because a job is so fundamental to people, to their livelihood, to their sense of identity, and recognizing that is a really overwhelming and daunting proposition for people. So yeah, again, building those relationships is so important to ensure that you're going to be able to make connections with workers, and that they will have the appropriate sense that their stories are going to be respected and told sensitively. So following on from the workers' compensation stuff was what sort of got me on to the first bigger investigation that I did as a star reporter, and that was the investigation into the General Electric factory in Peterborough and the occupational cancer claims that were coming out of that plant from years of exposure to chemicals and carcinogens. And that was, again, part of this sort of huge response from readers to the coverage of the WSIB. And I got a phone call one day from a woman in Peterborough who said, I think you'd be really interested to hear our struggle with the WSIB and getting these cancer claims recognized. And it was kind of a lesson for me, because I think as reporters, especially in this day and age, it's really easy to get lazy about picking up the phone and calling people and talking in person, rather than sending an email or seeing what people are chattering about on Twitter and following social media. And those things can be really useful tools, but I don't, there's really no substitute to calling someone up and just having a chat on the phone and meeting in person and building a real relationship with them. The next big kind of investigation that we worked on, it was a team of us at the Star, but was the Undercover story on temp agency workers. So I thought I would spend a little bit of time talking about how we came across that story and how we went about covering it, but I might just stop now to see if anyone has any questions before I get into that. It doesn't look like it. So I will move on to Undercover and Temp Nation. So this story, the genesis of this story was really kind of a melding, I guess, of these two big themes that I'd been covering on my beat. One was precarious work, and the other was health and safety and injured workers. And I think this story was really a combination of both of those things, and I needed those 2 or 3 years of building up my knowledge and context on both of those subjects before this story was even really possible. But the genesis was, first of all, through my 2 or 3 years at that point, I guess it was 2 years at that point, reporting on precarious work. I had kind of heard over and over again anecdotally that temp agency workers, they'd always get the most dangerous work. They were treated like they were disposable. They were getting injured. So I started looking into it and found that, sure enough, in the United States, there'd been research and investigative journalism that had proven that had requested the statistics and found that temp agency workers are more vulnerable to getting injured on the job, and have a significantly higher risk, in fact, of getting hurt on the job than permanently hired workers. So I wanted to see if the same thing was happening here in Canada. But the problem was that we don't keep the same kinds of statistics as they do in the US. So I had to start thinking about how I could get around that and kind of strategize as to how to tell this story. I kind of felt like I knew there was a story there, but I wasn't sure how to show it. So I started off by reading hundreds of court bulletins, basically, that the Ministry of Labor issues every time a worker is killed or injured on the job and their employer is convicted. And I just manually isolated all of the instances where the worker who was injured was a temp agency worker. And from there, I requested all of the ministry investigations through Freedom of Information request of those cases involving temp agency workers. I got the court transcripts from the prosecutions, and that was how I came across this company called Fiera Foods, an industrial bakery that was in North York. And just I started reading about the kind of people involved in the accidents, precarious workers, new Canadians, people whose lives, were turned upside down by these accidents, and something about the Fiera story in particular just kind of grabbed me, and I started digging into them further and requesting their health and safety record going back, I think, about 2 decades, and finding that, in fact, another temp agency worker had died there in 1999, and finding that over the years, from their Ministry of Labor record, they'd been issued time and time again with all these health and safety orders. But at the same time, they were getting rebates from the WSIB, they were getting, a grant from the government to expand. And so I was already sensing that, this was definitely a story. But as I was researching, another temp agency worker died in an industrial accident inside the factory. And so that was when we decided as a newsroom to really start pursuing it. And I began making contacts with workers inside the factory who described this environment where almost everyone was hired through a temp agency. Where people were extremely vulnerable. Many, again, were new Canadians who maybe weren't aware of their rights or didn't speak English as a first language. And the real challenge was that none of these workers were in a secure enough of a position to speak on the record about their experiences. So that is when we began talking about going undercover, and that's a really big decision as a news organization to make, and it has to pass a very rigorous test of a story that's in the public interest. Not only is it in the public interest, but there's really no other way to tell the story, and that needs to be signed off on by, your editors, your lawyer, the editor-in-chief, the managing editor. So we discussed it for a really long time. We strategized about it and eventually decided that I would go into the factory. And that's what I did. So I spent the month of May last year working inside the factory as a temp agency worker. And on top of that, to kind of flush out the story and make it less about this one factory, but about a system that across Ontario and across Canada that relies on temp labor to do risky work, and often doesn't provide workers with enough training to keep them safe. We also filed a bunch of freedom of information requests. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that process, because it can be quite a difficult one to navigate. So and I'm happy to answer any questions about tips in filing FOIs. But the real challenge is that often you're really going in blind. Like, you have a vague idea of what you want, but you don't know what records the government has. You don't know what they're called. And it's hard to be specific in what you're requesting. So it can feel a bit like a fishing expedition. So in this case, we put in dozens of freedom of information requests. Some of them ended up not being super helpful, and some of them were extremely helpful. But the first thing we did was request the name and address and year of registration of basically every temp agency in Canada. We went to all of the workers' compensation boards and asked for those records. And that ended up being useful because, first of all, it showed us that Ontario was really the epicenter of the temp agency industry. But also, when we actually got the physical addresses, we started to just see this trend that a lot of them were PO boxes or a virtual office. And we didn't know it at the time when we got that data back, because that was actually before I went undercover. But it ended up being really crucial to actually tracking down the temp agency that hired me, because I was able to look up their details and find out where their offices were, which ended up being an empty unit in a strip mall. But had I not had that FOI, it would have been very difficult to track down these players. So the second sort of set of FOIs that we put in were trying to get some kind of statistical analysis of what is happening to temp agency workers on the job and their injury rates, which again was really difficult because we don't keep Statistics Canada doesn't keep very good record, or they don't gather very good data on that. But what I was able to get through the Alberta Workers' Compensation Board when I was putting in all of these FOIs was a document that they had, which is actually a public document that they pointed me to, that had all of the kind of indicators broken down by sector. So they had the injury rates, the severity rates, how much the average injury cost the compensation board for the temp agency sector as compared to all of the other sectors, which was exactly what I wanted for Ontario, to be able to prove, what is happening with temps as opposed to everyone else. And that was kind of what allowed me to place a really precise request to the WSIB, because I essentially just copied and pasted what the Alberta Workers' Compensation Board had done. And that, I guess, was sort of my takeaway, is that, doing your homework as to what exactly you're looking for and what the correct terminology is that you're going to get the information that you want out of the government body is super important, because otherwise they could very well dodge around your question. So you want to use the right language to get the responsive record. The second the second challenge was kind of working undercover and also trying to maintain a beat while I was at it. And obviously the sort of challenge in trying to remain a reporter while you're actually doing the job and you're sort of living the story was very difficult. And obviously we were working long hours in physically really demanding conditions at this factory. I was surrounded by new Canadians who really didn't have a choice whether to leave or not, whereas I did. So it was certainly difficult to maintain, I think, the right perspective as a journalist telling that story. Oh, my cat has joined us, so sorry about that. And I think that's a challenge that for those of you who are reporting on labor issues probably face as well. You're confronted a lot of the time with stories that are emotionally challenging and striking the right balance between empathy and compassion and also, oops, audio feed is terrible, sorry. Yeah, maintaining that balance between compassion and your role as a journalist and as a professional can be difficult. The third challenge for this story was finding the family of the young woman who died in the factory. For those of you who are interested in digging into these types of topics, industrial accidents and health and safety incidences, you will find very quickly that trying to get information on industrial accidents in this province is a nightmare. You can't get freedom of information requests on ministry investigations into workplace accidents until charges have been laid and a conviction has happened. So that could be literally years. So we couldn't get any information officially through official channels on what happened to Amina Diaby, the woman who died in September 2016. We tried the Ministry of Labor. As I said, we tried Freedom of Information route. We tried the coroner. We hung out at the police station trying to get someone to talk to us, and we just got absolutely nowhere. And so, again, this is where I think, for me, building those grassroots contacts is so essential to this beat, because it was actually literally through my contacts and myself cold calling people, random people in the city, that we found Amina Diaby's family. A contact of mine reached out to someone whose cousin was working in the factory the day that Amina died. The cousin said she's from Gambia. I called the Gambian Cultural Association, and the guy who picked up said, "That's my friend's wife." And it turned out that she wasn't from Gambia at all. He just happened to know her. So again, there's really no substitute to having those good grassroots contacts who are connected really to people across the city and can, the best source of information, really. I think I've probably maybe started to hit the point where I'm rattling on too long. So I will quickly maybe talk about pitching, and then if anyone has any questions, we can go from there. So I started trying to think of advice to give when it comes to pitching labor stories, and quickly realized that you guys, oh, a question already. Okay, I'll get to that in a sec. You guys are probably far more adept at making good pitches than I am, but what I would say is, different publications probably have a different perspective or a different level of interest in labor issues. The Star, again, as I said, it's sort of part of who we are as a paper. but we certainly, I'm only one person, and we can't cover everything. So there's definitely there's a ton of stories out there on this beat that are not being told. And while other publications may be a bit of a tougher sell, I think that, since I started this beat 3.5 years ago, there's been a real change in the climate around these issues. I think the political currents are really changing, and the changing workplace review that happened at the provincial level and is now happening at the federal level, the minimum wage increase, all of this stuff has become a lot more mainstream, and people are really paying attention to it. So I guess my one piece of advice would be, to try and hook your story to those broader political currents and broader conversations that are happening. And the second would really, again, be to try your best in your pitch to show that you can put a human face to it. Someone whose story really represents what you're trying to tell and is going to give readers that personal connection to it. All that aside, I will tackle Dawn's question here. Can you imagine doing this kind of work as a freelancer? I mean, I'm definitely I'm very lucky to have a staff job, and certainly, the Undercover story, could I do that as a freelancer? Absolutely not, because I had so much legal advice to do that story. I had so much editorial support from my editors, from so many people in the newsroom who pitched in to help. We had stats people working on the stats. We had digital design people. We had, a photographer who was, sorting out a spy camera for me. And then once the story was actually complete, and we approached the factory and said, this is what we found. What's your response? We had, a criminal prosecutor who sent us a letter saying he was going to prosecute me for trespassing and all of this stuff. We had them telling us they were going to sue us for libel. And, as a freelancer, like, those are obviously a huge risk to take without institutional support, to say nothing of like the expense of filing all of those freedom of information requests. It's not cheap. So, although I will say, for those of you who are interested in filing FOIs, if you can make an argument that releasing the information is in the interest of public health and safety, you can get a fee waiver. So top tip if you're trying to save money. But yeah, certainly for these bigger investigations, I think that institutional support is super helpful. But there's a ton of stories out there where you don't need that kind of support, and that are totally doable as a freelancer. How much does an FOI typically cost? It, again, really depends. So federally, I will say, if you're filing a federal Freedom of Information request, the fees I have got back are usually really low. I don't know why provincially they seem to be a lot more. For a ministry investigation into an accident, and how long do they take? Good question. You're probably looking at maybe a couple $100 to get a few investigations. Like if you requested, say 5 accident investigations, I think I paid a couple $100 for those. I'm trying to think of some of the more expensive ones that I've had fee estimates that are somewhere that are, north of $500 or $600. And we can't, even as the Toronto Star, we can't always afford to pursue all of those. Again, some FOI offices will give you a fee waiver if you argue, if you successfully argue that releasing the information is in the public's health and safety. But yeah, generally you're looking at anywhere from $100 to $500 for an FOI. As for how long they take, it really depends on the Freedom of Information Office. The Ministry of Labor, I'm sorry to say, is incredibly slow. I'm sure it's not their fault. I think they just get a lot of requests from maybe more than other offices because they have like unions and stuff making a lot of requests for their members and stuff. But they're really slow. The WSIB is generally a lot quicker. So they're supposed to give you an answer in about a month, but they can request a timeline extension. So I've had some FOIs that have gotten back in a month or so. I've had others that it's taken me a year plus a complaint to the privacy commissioner to get a response from them. So it's kind of hit or miss. Can you speak a bit more about putting a human face on a story, but also protecting precarious workers who are worried about speaking on the record? Yeah, sorry, my screen is moving. I think that's probably my biggest challenge as a journalist because, you know, in the case of the Fiera Foods Undercover story, I mean, that was a very unique set of circumstances, and we can't go undercover for every story in order to protect the identity of vulnerable workers. I mean, I really feel it's definitely a weight on me as a reporter asking workers to put their name out there because I know, you know, the reprisal is real, and the fear of being blacklisted or being blackballed by employers is very real, and I guess my advice is there are workers out there who want to stand up and feel are in a place in their life where maybe they are able to stand up. Maybe they've left the employer that was abusive or whatever, or for whatever reason they want to put their name to it. And I think it's important to find those people and highlight their voices because it has like a positive onward effect. Like it breaks the fear and the stigma for other workers as well to come forward. And I think and it also makes other workers, like I think one of the most common things I've heard back from readers who are writing in is saying, I don't feel comfortable speaking on the record, but I feel less alone now that I've seen this person who is willing to stand up and say something. And it allows people to connect their story to someone else's story and to a bigger picture situation. There are definitely instances where we would give someone anonymity if they're still working for the employer, or in particular circumstances we would consider that, but we do have pretty strict kind of editorial policy around that. If someone is the main kind of character in a story, they got to use their name usually. And so, yeah, it's, those grassroots kind of contacts who you build a relationship with and trust you enough to refer you to workers is really important to finding those people who do feel comfortable to speak on the record. In addition to the stark reality that 70% of employees are not union members, and there are other reasons for the decision, are there other reasons for the decision not to focus on collective bargaining, union organizing? Full disclosure, I currently work for a union, but I'm departing soon and considering whether anyone might be interested in freelance stories on union-related developments. Oh, hi, Brad. No, it's really, for me, like, I guess for me, the main reason is that there's only one of me in the newsroom, and I have to think carefully. I can't do every story, and so I have to think strategically about like where's how do I want to use like the space that I have in the paper to talk about these issues. And for me, like my editorial judgment, and this is just me, is that I would like to use that space to talk about vulnerable workers who don't have another space or platform to have their stories kind of showcased. That being said, if there were two of me, like I would love to do more on organizing and union organizing in particular, which I think is a super important topic, and as well as union politics as well. I think in terms of interest from readers, like those stories I find usually don't do as well. I think maybe they're a little bit less relatable now that fewer and fewer people belong to a union themselves. But I think with any topic, it's how you tell the story, right? Like you can turn the most seemingly mundane story into something really interesting if you have the right context and the right people to bring it to life. And so I think it's definitely worth pitching on union related stories. As a labor reporter, what do you consider to be the best sources of public documents when you are looking into stories of abused and injured workers? Are there go-to places that can spare you the time? Yes, and I made a little list actually for people, and everyone is welcome to email me at any time if they want more information. But I made a quick list of publicly available stuff that I find to be super handy. One is the Ministry of Labor's Convictions Archive and its court bulletins, which are all on its website, and you can, it's really boring, but you can read through all of that stuff, and you might start to see some patterns in terms of repeat offenders or employers who have that have been issued a really high fine, which would probably signify that something more serious has happened. And you can also get a sense of what kind of employers are being prosecuted, which would suggest which industries is it worth looking into, because it might be a high risk industry in terms of app hasn't been put on there yet, but it will be at some point. Oh, it's frozen. Better. Okay. I don't know how much of my last answer cut out, but I was talking about the Ministry of Catalog, which, if you monitor that, should be posting in the near future a bunch of statistics that they are making publicly available. Okay, I didn't say anything more than that. The next super useful, maybe the most useful source of information is the City of Toronto's industry profile. So if you just Google City of Toronto industry profile, so Statistics Canada obviously gathers through the Labour Force Survey information on work in Ontario and Canada, but they don't release the data that is really interesting, I think, in terms of digging down into precarious work. I think you have to request a special run of that or something. Anyway, the City of Toronto does request a special run, and the profile that they put together every year breaks down employment trends for every industry in the city. And the reason why it's so useful in terms of covering precarious work is that it shows you the shift over time from permanent work to temporary work in wages, median wages, average wages, union versus non-union rates, female versus male, like all this really granular information that is super helpful in trying to map out what's going on in certain industries. So, for example, for the Undercover story, I was able to look at those profiles and see that the food manufacturing industry, which is what I was working in, has seen this huge explosion in temporary labor. So from that, we're able to say, okay, it's not just this factory; it's a trend across the city. So that is super helpful. And the last one that I was going to recommend is the WSIB has just made the decision to make all employers' injury claim record public information. So it's called Compass. If you Google WSIB Compass, it has a ton of information on lost time injury claims by employer. So yeah, you can kind of see what injury rates are like at different employers across the province. Was your Undercover experience the condition of providing anonymity to coworkers who told you shop floor stories or relayed their personal experience? So none of my coworkers knew that I was a journalist. Some of them who I became quite close to, I told them before the story was published who I was. It was a bit of a delicate line to be walking because I didn't want I didn't want to get too close to anyone because I figured that once it came out who I was, that anyone who was seen as being too close to me or talking to me all the time was going to get in shit. So again, it was that challenge of kind of living the story, but also trying to maintain the right amount of distance from it. And so for the people who I did contact to say this is who I am and this story is coming out, I assured them that nothing in the story would identify anyone. And I tried my best not to pull. I pulled mostly from like my observations of things that happened organically rather than me asking questions of people of their personal experiences or their personal thoughts. Like I didn't want it to be too contrived, or be asking leading questions and that kind of thing. I wanted to, as much as possible, be an observer and let the things that happened organically kind of tell the story. So that's how I kind of managed that. But we would never, given that I wasn't forthcoming from day one about who I was and I was undercover, we would never have compromised anyone's identity by revealing who they were in that story. Any other? Let me see if I've missed it. Were you worried that you would be discovered? You would have to keep your personal life personal? Yeah. Yeah. I was worried. I think the harder part was keeping my personal life personal because I really didn't. Obviously, the whole thing was a bit of a deception, which obviously we thought was justified because of the public interest value. But it's really hard to not be honest about who you are with people who you're forming a relationship with, and who are kind and nice and people who you would be friends with in real life, and so I tried to keep my story as close to reality as possible. but not being able to be fully transparent was very difficult. In terms of being worried that I was discovered, we kind of talked about, okay, what happens if they figure out who I am on the job? And the response to that was just tell them, say, yeah, this is who I am. We've requested all of these records. We have all of this information. What's your response to it? And just, we had to confront them at some point to fulfill our responsibilities as journalists, to ask them and give them the right of reply to these allegations. So, if had I been discovered, I would have just asked them the same questions that I ultimately ended up asking them, later on in the process. But yeah, it would have been very unpleasant had they actually discovered me while I was on the job, I'm sure. Yes, it is conflicting. Yeah, it's hard. It was a difficult experience. But again, I tried as best as I could to pull on observations of things that were happening around me, rather than like creating quote unquote interviews or things that would later be used as fodder for the story, because it felt I didn't want to be asking leading questions, or I was just conscious of trying to do it as ethically as I could, given that I wasn't being fully transparent about who I was. Can you comment on the challenges of reporting the stories of vulnerable workers, if they don't speak English, and if it's hard to reach them on the phone? Yeah, that is tough, because so many precarious workers are new Canadians. I find it's in those situations, I do try really hard to meet people in person rather than do phone interviews, because it's much easier to communicate. A lot of the times, if you're going through the legal clinics or worker centers, and they're connecting you to workers, in the past, they've been very kind in also providing translation as well, or sometimes we'll have another reporter or photographer in the newsroom who speaks the language. So that, language barrier can definitely be a challenge. But so far it's been okay, just because everyone has been super accommodating in terms of translation services and all that kind of stuff. And I would, when possible, I do try and meet in person. How did I handle the emotional side of covering the story? I think having my editors are super supportive. I have two wonderful editors who provide great editorial guidance, but also were super supportive emotionally as well. And it was just, I think the important part was reminding me and reminding myself of why I was doing the story. And I think, that's probably something that for anyone who's covering these types of issues, if you will be covering stories often that are emotionally challenging. And so the important thing is to just not lose sight of when it's feeling tough, or you're struggling a little bit with it, to remember why you're doing it, which is, you're creating a space for folks to share their stories, and casting a light on, a systemic problem that's probably affecting, a ton of people out there who haven't seen their stories and themselves reflected in the media. Which is nice. It's nice to be able to communicate that stuff. So yeah, that's sort of how I try and look at it. One more question. I see one more person typing, so I'll let them finish. Okay, I'll start on question number 1. Oh, okay, bye. Advice for someone breaking into labor as a beat. As a I would say, first of all, being able to market yourself as someone who has this niche knowledge and contacts is, I think, is a great asset. And I think in terms of building the context that you need to really create that beat and be the master of it. Again, I feel like I'm a broken record, but making the connection with legal clinics and workers centers and really the people who are closest to the stories. You know, I think there's sort of a temptation for some people to go to, you know, the big law firms that deal with employment or labor issues, and for me, those, like, they're great, but in terms of you know, breaking stories, like finding news stories and kind of being ahead of the competition. You know, problems don't really get onto the radar of bigger organizations, whether it's a law firm or whatever, until the grassroots, the legal clinics, the, you know, grassroots organizers have seen them first. And so that's kind of where I would recommend starting, and like the, you know, the other contexts will fill in as time goes on, but yeah, in terms of like really getting a grasp of the story, and also being able to make connections with the people who will connect you to workers who are at the heart of the beat. I would really suggest starting with yeah, the worker centers, organizers, legal clinics, that kind of thing.
And I think I'm on now. Sara, thanks very much for doing that, despite the little glitches we
Thanks.
had at the beginning, but that was fantastic. It looks like everybody has enjoyed it as well. And I can tell people that we believe the recording worked on this, so that we will be posting it in our
Oh.
members only website afterwards. So thanks again, and I'll
Okay,
let
great.
you take yourself off
Thank
now
you.
on there. And we will. You're okay with us giving people your email, so if they have any questions for you.
Yeah, that's totally fine. I mean, it's on our website as well, but yeah, you're welcome to email, get in touch anytime, and I will do my best to help.
Great. Great. Thanks again. Take care.
All right, thank you so much.
So for those who haven't seen me before, I'm Don Genova. I'm president of CMG Freelance, who along with CWA Canada Associates presented this to you today. And just wanted to let you know that, you know, as I said, these webinars, the recordings of them are available to people who are members of CMG Freelance. And to join, all you have to do is go to cmgfreelance.ca and check it out. You'll see all kinds of information about the benefits of joining. A few of the things include webinars like this, advice from us on contracts. I can tell you over the past few months, I've been getting a lot of questions about contracts coming to people from publishers, and it's the contracts are just becoming more and more onerous, and we like to try to help you sort them out and understand them, and also try to suggest alternative language that you can propose to the employer. so that you're not kind of giving up everything when you sign one of these contracts. We also have free online software training with lynda.com. I also found out we have free software training with kelby1.com, which is really a great site for photographers, and we offer 2-week licenses as that. As always, you can get access to group health benefits and assistance with that if you need like, affordable extended health care, a profile on our webpage, access to the Lancer, which is our listserv for freelancers to get in touch with each other and ask advice. Storyboard is something I know some of you on here came from our storyboard posting. That's something that we fund. We have a part-time editor who updates that site with original material 3 or 4 times a week. And as always, we're interested in pitches on freelance life as well. And yes, we do pay, and our contract is a fair contract, not as onerous as all those other ones that are out there now. So that's just a few of the things that are available. And if you have questions, if you're a student and you have questions about our CWA associate program, then you can check with Kayla on that. And you can, what's the website for that, Kayla? I'm trying to remember if there's an actual, the easy website to go to for that. And she'll probably put it in the chat right now, emergingworkers.ca. Thank you very much. So anyway, thanks everybody for tuning in, and for members, we'll be sending out a note when we get this one uploaded. People who watch the Instagram webinar, believe it or not, we did find a recording of that from somebody who watched it, and that should be uploaded hopefully within the next week or so. We'll send out a note about that as well. That's it for now. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you again next time.